everyone. Rita McGrath here. I'm delighted to be joining you on LinkedIn Live. And my guest this week is a dear friend, a colleague, an esteemed author, professor at MIT, and also the founder of MIT's Leadership Center, as well as a mainstay in their executive education programs. And what we're going to be talking about is the new edition of her terrific book, xTEAMS. We'll talk about teams and then also some of the other things that she's coming up with. And appropriately for Halloween, some of this might involve ghosts. So welcome, Deborah Ancona.
Well, thank you, Rita. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be having this conversation.
Absolutely. So maybe start with xTEAMS. I mean, teamwork being a topic both you and I have looked at a lot over the years. And what prompted you to write it, and what continues to be the need for this book?
Yeah, so what prompted the original writing was a stream of research that we had done whereby what we thought accounted for team performance wasn't working anymore. So this was way back when, my dissertation, which was very sad because went in and we studied a number of sales teams in an organization, and what we thought would lead to sales team performance, that is clear goals, clear roles, good problem solving in the team, all the things that we learn about as key to team success. And when we looked at those variables compared to team satisfaction, very high correlations. If you did those things, people would be satisfied. But then we looked at actual revenue that these sales teams brought in, and lo and behold, zero. There was zero connection between these good team attributes and ways of behaving and actual team performance as brought in by those teams. And that was a bit of a panic moment for me. You don't want your dissertation to have a zero in terms of results. But in fact, people were very excited about that finding because it called into question the way we even think about what team effectiveness is, what creates team effectiveness. And so what followed were a number of years of many, many different studies in which we began to see that it wasn't just what happened inside a team, although that's still very important. You have to pair that with xTEAMS, externally active teams, teams that also go outside their boundaries to learn, to connect, to get resources, to do a number of things. And so that's why we wrote the original book, to say, whoa, the model that's burnt into our brains actually may not be right. And so here's another way of thinking about it. And that was also some years ago. And so now why a second edition is because, in fact, there's an even greater need for teams to be able to adapt, to learn, to innovate in this moment in time when we have not just a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's VUCA on steroids, because those things are even more apt. And we've got the added dimension of an exponentially changing world. That is, speed is just taking over. And so the reason for the second book is to say, whoa, people, we haven't really changed our mental models, and yet the need is even greater than it was before.
Yeah, I would argue. So in case you're just joining us, we're talking with Deborah Ancona, and this is her terrific new edition of her book, xTEAMS, How to Build Teams That Lead, Innovate, and Succeed. So one of the things I would also observe, when it comes to teams, is that we are putting so much more demand on teams. And you mentioned that sort of toward the end of the book, that, I like to think of the world as creating new competitive advantages through the innovation process, which is usually almost always done by a team. Then you have that period where you've got something built and you can kind of run it. And that's what we teach people about. But then, when an old advantage goes away, you've now got to transform the organization to change its center of gravity to be something else. And I think we do a pretty good job of teaching people about that middle bit. We're not particularly effective teaching people about the front end, although I've been talking about this for a long, long time. And we're also not great at helping people learn how to transform. And so what we're seeing now is these very stressed organizations where the hierarchies are getting flatter, So people are moving into these huge jobs, often without the support and the preparation that they might have had in an earlier era. And I think this whole notion of externally focused teams becomes so important because you talk about creating this almost like lattice-like structure, which is devolved power, right? Where it's not bound to a hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, we refer to that as creating nimble organizations, but part and parcel of these new organizational forms is the concept of distributed leadership.
Mhm.
That we're moving away from command and control. All decision making comes from on high to leadership at all levels. And if you have leadership at all levels, the way to make that happen is through these kinds of X teams. Although we don't always use that as a way of re-architecting, if you will, our organizations to be able to be more innovative, to enable those executives who now have a bigger job and need to empower others. How do you do that? People don't always know how to do that. And so X teams provide a vehicle to help move the organization to a more distributed leadership format.
Oh, and it's such a struggle. It's such a struggle. So I was noticing on, let me just see if I've got it. Page 95 of the book, you've got this really cool chart, which see if I can show you guys, which sort of provides an architecture, if you will, going from exploration to experimentation and execution. And then this critical thing that often gets left out, exportation. And I don't think we talk enough about that when we're talking about agile teams. That it's not enough for your team to get where it needs to go. You've now got to take that, and let's say you're creating a new product. You've now got to get dozens, hundreds, potentially even thousands of people on board with this thing. And so how do you now take that knowledge that's been sort of buried in your own little team's interactions and spread it more widely?
Yeah, and you're bringing up actually the two sides of it, the beginning and the end, or the first phase and the third phase, and we focus on execution and experimentation in the middle. But in the early phase is when you have to do what we call sense making. You have to look at what's different in the world and what particularly is important for you to pay attention to. So if you have an exponentially changing world, then your model of the world is basically out of date whenever you start a new task. And so part of what you need to do is get out into the broader ecosystem and understand, how have my customer needs changed? How has technology changed? How are other people using this technology? What works? What doesn't work? What's the political arena? Really understanding all of these things while simultaneously building that network, that lattice that you talk about. You need to set up those relationships up the organization and across the organization and even outside the organization in order to get buy-in, in order to get people excited and interested in what you're doing, in order to get resources. All of those things are necessary. And if you don't do that early on, then that later phase where you want to get the word out is much, much harder. You want to get that buy-in early. You want to get people on your team early so that you take them along with you, and then they become ambassadors. It's not just you, the ambassador, but you've got others in the organization ignited, if you will, with excitement about what's going on. But as you point out, that latter stage is also incredibly important. And so we watch teams do just incredible kinds of things. They create a presentation and they send all the team members out to give that presentation to explain what is the new thing the team did, whether it's a product or a process or a new way of organizing. They get out and tell other people about it, or they get their senior managers to work at that senior level so that the power structure also gets on board with what it is that you're doing. In one team, you couldn't actually even join the team unless you were able to go out and talk to other people about why the team's work was so important and the results so incredible. So really working, sometimes team members join in with groups that are taking over. So let's say you're an engineering team, then someone joins the manufacturing team. Or if you're finishing up a product that needs to go to marketing, then you join together with the marketing team to give them the enthusiasm, the information, whatever it is. So that partnering to keep the momentum going is a real skill for teams to develop.
And I don't think it always comes naturally. I mean, one of the people that endorsed your book is kind of an iconic figure to me, Alan Mullally. And, he makes it look really easy, but it's not. So in the book, you talk about 3 principles for kind of building these teams, and go out before you go in, which is kind of counterintuitive. Build a robust internal environment, and then be prepared to pivot. And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on what that looks like. So, I'm attending this LinkedIn Live. I'm listening to Deborah and Rita talk. I'd like to get started doing it. Where do I even begin?
Great. Yeah. So number 1, out before in. And that's kind of the motto of xTEAMS. I always say in my classes, if you remember nothing else from today, it's out before in. And that's just not what we kind of normally move to. Teams suffer from solution mindedness, from groupthink, from all of this push toward the internal. And so recognizing that first you have to go outside, because if you create your goals and your roles and your norms inside the team without recognizing that, again, your information about the external environment might be wrong, without input from other stakeholders, without learning what's the latest, what are my competitors doing in my space? If I don't pay attention to that, I'm going to be zooming ahead, maybe in the wrong direction or with something that's already been done. So that out before in is really doing that sense making, that learning about key parts of your environment. It also means ambassadorship. So out before in is up, again, getting that support from upper levels of the organization. And then the third component of out before in is task coordination. It is seldom the case anymore that we're working in isolated teams. Teams rely on the input from others and have to get their output out into the rest of the organization or the rest of the world. And so what you want to do is figure out, who do I need to connect to, and how do we do that? How do we negotiate deadlines and inputs and outputs so that we're all working on the same in the same direction? So out before in, do your sense making, your ambassadorship, and your task coordination. And the book outlines very completely how to do that. In fact, chapter 6 is a how-to guide, how to move ahead and do this. So out before in, go out. But then it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not saying that all the things that we've learned about teams, about creating clear goals and roles and norms, all of Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, on the importance of learning, all of that is very key still. And in fact, it's even more important, because once you go out into the world and collect a lot of information, you need to pull it back in and say, what have we learned? Right? What does it mean for how we move ahead? And so all of those internal characteristics of teams are still very important. It's pulling together the internal and the external. And then the third piece is something that I've actually worked on for a while and is coming back into vogue, which is very exciting. And that's a kind of temporal dimension. So the first 2 dimensions are what you have to do to be an effective xTEAM. You need to get out. You need to do that immediately. You need to then pull in and figure out how to become a solid team that knows how to be aligned with one another, listen to one another, have active debate. But there's a when question. So when suggests what Anita Woolley and Anna Mayo talked about as burstiness. I talk about it as pulsing, that you have to develop a rhythm or a pulsing. Okay, we need to go out, but then we need to come in. So part of the pulse is out. What did we learn? How do we digest? Out again, in again. You create a pattern of out and in. Another pattern is together apart. And that's very important in this day and age when we have certain members of our team are often virtual. And so the together is when we build the team, right? Because it's harder to build culture and belonging and synergy when everybody's all over the place. So when you're together, you want to really make sure that you can get all that done and then move apart, and people can do the separate things they need to do or partner with whomever they need to partner with. So together, apart, doing versus learning. Get out there, be active, but then again, learn. What came out of that? Another is high energy and calm. One of the things right now is that people are just burned out. It's just go, go, go. And one of the reasons actually that people are leaving organizations is because of this innovation flux continuously. And so being able to go, all right, we have a deadline, we have to get this done, and really working hard, but then offering some restorative time to come to calm. And so these are rhythms, pulsing, if you will, of different kinds of activity that also focus the team.
Mm-hmm.
Because in times of turbulent times, you have to focus. Otherwise, there's too much coming at you and there's too much to do. So what are we going to do now? Okay. And then what are we going to do next? And what are we going to do next? And this pulsing provides a rhythm to do that.
I really like that, because one thing I would observe is people are just fried. And I don't think in many cases leaders recognize that, yeah, you could have 3 intense weeks of a sprint, let's say, to use agile methodology, right? But then you need a week off, and it needs to be incorporated in the work. It's not like you can do your recovery, in your spare time when you're trying to tend to all kinds of other aspects of your life. So I love that idea of consciously and proactively saying, this is what we're doing this week, and then we're going to change what we're doing after that. Has a lot in common with something that Tom Kolbitz, who wrote a great book called In Extremis Leadership. He says, in dangerous situations or situations which are very stressful, you really need to bring down the emotional temperature, and you really need to get people focused on something outside themselves. So I think it's quite similar to your message there.
The other thing I would bring up is that this is for the team, yes, but then the team needs to, in temporal language, entrain to the larger environment. So you want to set your deadlines not only for what works in the team, but do you have to meet a client's product launch time, in which case you need to be ready to go then, and then you can pull back. Also, it's a role of higher level leaders. There was an article which I loved on Smuckers, where they have an organizational rhythm where people can live wherever they want, be wherever they want, but 22 weeks a year are when you come together. That's when you do your strategic planning. That's when you do your culture building. That's when the teams that need to be together in intensive times get together. That's where networking comes in. You're all there, you put it into that time. And then again, people go off and can work on other things. So you can have an organizational rhythm within which xTEAMS can then create their rhythms.
That's really interesting. Well, I think this topic is so essential right now. And for those of you that just joined us, I'm with Deborah Ancona, and we're talking about her great book, xTEAMS. People, there's such a high volume of people reporting being disengaged, quiet quitting, not being fully present at work, feeling underappreciated, feeling underconnected. And I think a lot of what you talk about in the book could be a real antidote to that.
Absolutely. I always say, because, when I'm teaching, sometimes we get the complaint from both sides, the complaint from the millennials or the Gen Zs. Okay, well, we didn't go through all this pain in order to be sitting in front of a computer monitor for 8 hours a day. That's not exciting. They're looking for greater meaning. And the folks who are at the older end of the spectrum saying, well, nothing is getting done. It's not happening the way that we want it to have happen. And I say, well, one of the things is to make work more compelling. This is in line with Zeynep's work on, creating interesting jobs. And how great is it to take a team of people, including younger folks who are quietly quitting. It doesn't have to be only younger folks, but people who are quietly quitting or not engaged, to say, okay, we're going to focus on this and go talk to these people and go observe these people. I know when my daughter was a summer intern, the lowest part of the totem pole, she was working for Li and Feng, an organization that deals with supply chains in the fashion industry, distribution channels. And the senior people wanted to know, what are the current fashion trends? And so what did they do? They took those lower level people, these summer interns, young folks, and they said, you have the afternoon off. Take your phone and take pictures of New York, Milan, and Paris. Go take pictures of the hottest boutiques in your cities. Bring it all together. What are you seeing as the trends? And they did it within city and then across city, and then they presented their views. And I can tell you that was a fun assignment. People were motivated, and it was useful to the organization, and it was a way of getting people outside of just a rhythm that they might find unexciting.
Oh, absolutely. And those kinds of serendipitous customer things can be so interesting. So there's a sort of a crunchy, nutty health store in Canada, whose name escapes me at the moment, but they ask their customers to send them pictures of the customers consuming this company's products. And of course, it's supposed to be healthy. It's supposed to be an on-the-go. And what do you know? They received a copy of a picture of a Snickers bar as a healthy snack. And they were like, what? Like, this thing is loaded with nuts and sugar and high fructose corn syrup and all the stuff that we're not supposed to eat. But if you're running down an airport hallway or something and you're late for your plane, you don't have time to stand around and consume a salad leaf by leaf, right? And so in that particular context, it attributed in somebody's mind to being a healthy snack. It also led them to develop a whole line of bars, portable bars that people could eat. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of an interesting, they weren't expecting that. And very often I think this sense making is where you run across the things that aren't expected.
Yeah, no, and it's so important. And I was working in a pharma company, and they wanted to bring biotech within. And so how do you do that? They didn't really have a good model of that. So we created a couple of xTEAMS, and they went to do their sense making with pharma companies that were further ahead than they were, with biotech companies, with experts in the field, with the people who advised different pharma companies on what was going on, with organizational experts about new architectures, if you will. And they came back and brought all that together. And one of the guys sent me an email, and he said, we've learned more in the past 3 weeks than we have in the last 10 years sitting at our desks in this organization. And so I think that speaks to the idea that we think we're doing sense making, but are we really doing it? Are we focused? Are we doing it together? Are we, if we go to talk to a biotech, it's not just, hi, how are you doing? But our contracts are like this, your contracts are like this. How do you do that in a regulated environment? You're using these suppliers, we're using these. Why do you think yours are better? It's very detailed information gathering that can just shift the way that you see your job and the next iteration of products or whatever it is that you're doing. And so that surprise factor, that learning factor is just incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm. Well,
it also empowers people. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh. No, go ahead.
It also empowers people. So, if we're trying to get more voice from people lower down in the organization, sometimes it's kind of scary to go and report into senior level leaders and say, this is what I want to do. But if you've done your sense making, if you've collected data, if you've got, I always say people, bring in your data, show them what it is, bring in a tape recording of why these particular clients are leaving your company and going somewhere else. And people feel more confident because they've got the data, they've got the reasoning. And when presenting it, they feel like they've got an edge. And so people who would ordinarily never suggest doing something feel empowered to say, hey, let's do this.
I love that. I love that. And it also gives permission, right, to people to be exploratory. I think that's a lot of times what holds people back. So we're coming up on Halloween, and I know you've got some new work about ghosts. So could you take a minute and just explain what you mean by ghosts in the family?
Sure. This is slightly outside of the xTEAM realm. So I also teach something called leadership signatures, your own unique way of leading. And in that course, we examine leadership signatures and then look at how to change them. But what I found was that when we go to change, people had to choose an improvement goal, and they would do something that was very shallow or unimportant. And so I wanted the course to be more meaningful. And so I connected in with Dennis Perkins, and who had written a little bit about this already. And we joined forces. We have an HBO article called Family Ghosts in the Executive Suite. And there we look at what are some of the dynamics in your family, your ghosts, if you will, the things that you've taken from your family into the executive suite, some of which are good. So I don't like, it's always about trauma or negativity. You have good ghosts. There are things that you took. I just did in my class, the good ghosts and the bad ghosts. And the good ghosts for my class are, I'm hardworking, I'm independent, I know how to take care of myself. There are a set of, these are my good ghosts. And you want to really claim those and build on those. Those are your strengths. And then there are the bad ghosts, the things that you continue to bring in from your childhood that maybe aren't so helpful. And this could be, again, I can pull on that, perfectionism. If it's not great, I'm not happy. Or an inability, a need to control. So then I can't empower. I can't let somebody else take over, because whatever happened in my family, it was dangerous to be out of control. And so I was controlled, and that's how I know how to be safe. And the good news is you're an adult. What you needed to be safe as a child does not necessarily translate into what you need to do now. But that takes some learning, some uncovering of what's really going on that inhibits you from empowering, from delegating, from listening, as opposed to being the smartest one in the room. All of those ghosts play out. And so getting people to understand what they are, from whence they come, so that they're not hidden, they're out there, and then you can work on them. You can change your cognition. You can change the way that you see what was going on. And
I love that.
It's great fun.
Oh, I bet.
It's great fun. One woman,
we're coming up on more time together. So go ahead. You wanted to say something?
One quick story is that one woman in my class, an earlier class, had an issue with authority. She came from a family where you did not push up. You paid attention to the authority structure in your family. And so she found herself having a difficult time disagreeing with senior level leaders, even though she often did. And she was she was a senior executive. And one of the things we have people do is look at role models. Who are people who have the same issues you have, but have succeeded in them and are really good without all of the negative ghost stories behind it. And so she had done her homework, and she had a number of role models of what she could do and how she could interact in a way that was difficult, but she thought she could try. And then in a meeting, one of the VPs was giving a presentation in which she really disagreed. And she's like, I'm not going to say anything. And then she said, okay, I'm going to channel this particular person. This is my time. I'm going to channel this. And she stood up and she said, well, I don't agree with this, and this is why. And I think we could do this. And all the things she had learned by kind of shadowing this other person. And she said, well, it was a little difficult because people were surprised that I said anything at all, but then they came and they supported me. So it was a positive kind of thing. But that's just an example of recognizing what it is that's keeping you from doing what you really feel you want to do in the executive role, and and stepping forward.
Yeah. And in a way, it's like you have to get outside yourself the same way teams have to start outside themselves, right? I think that's an interesting connection there. So you do work with companies. You've got a company of your own, I believe, which we can offer our listeners a link to, as well as this terrific book, new, out, updated. So for anyone who's part of a team or who needs to get a team to perform and who doesn't, it's just a very useful addition to your bookshelf. So I can highly recommend it. And Deborah, thank you. I could talk to you all day, but we don't have that much time. So thank you all. And what a pleasure, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yes, for all of you out there, out before in.
Indeed.